Now, are COVID-19 vaccines being used as an instrument, a tool in the global power struggle? When you look at what's going on, look at the evidence, the answer seems to be yes. And we can talk about that now with Dr. Michael Jennings, who's a reader in international development at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Hello, Michael.
Hi, good evening, John.
Hi, and Sophia Gaston joins us too, a director at the British Foreign Policy Group. Hello, Sophia.
Good evening.
Hi. Let me ask you both. Is there plenty of evidence then that COVID vaccines are being used in this way as a tool, as a bargaining chip in the global strategic power game? Michael?
Yes, I think we can see that quite clearly if we look at countries like Russia and China, but also India and Israel. We can clearly see that they're using them to gain influence. And of course, this shouldn't be a surprise. International aid has been used as a tool for soft power pretty much since it was launched in 1929. So it's kind of baked into it. So we can see it's going on, but, we shouldn't be surprised at all. And all countries engage with it in different ways.
Yeah. Sophia, can you give us some examples of where this is happening then?
So what's been really interesting is both China and Russia were pretty efficient at developing their vaccines. And certainly China is trying to make inroads into Africa with its vaccines. And we've also seen Russia trying to make inroads into Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, there are huge inequalities in access to vaccines. Most of the countries who've been able to develop them have enormous resources and tend to be on the wealthier side. And I think, we have to view this in the context of the way in which many other aspects of sort of crucial, what we can call infrastructure in the pandemic, starting with PPE and so on, have been used throughout. This has been an opportunity for many countries to try and sort of make diplomatic inroads. And we do see that they have been making a difference. China, for example, was able to deliver some much needed equipment to Italy very early on in the pandemic at the height of its crisis. And we did see public opinion in Italy towards China improving quite significantly off the back of that. So there are consequences.
Yeah. And Michael, an interesting example, take the case of Brazil, which seemed to be on the point of excluding China from its telecommunications infrastructure, excluding Huawei from 5G there. And then there was a need for vaccines. Brazil has an enormous problem with coronavirus infection. In went the Chinese vaccine by way of an agreement, and then suddenly in went China too by way of telecommunications and Huawei. These are not coincidences, are they?
No, I really don't think they are. And you can see both Russia and China competing for influence across Latin America more generally, where they've traditionally had perhaps slightly less influence. But I think we need to be slightly careful here in that recipient governments and recipient publics are not naive. I mean, this China's engagement in sub-Saharan Africa for aid investment as well as for health has been going on in a strong way for at least 2 decades. But people are aware of the strings that come attached. They welcome the support. They may give them some openings and some support, but It doesn't necessarily signal a long-term shift in power and power relations in different regions.
So Sophia, do you agree? You mentioned the relationship between Russia through the Sputnik vaccine to countries in Europe. So they're in Eastern European countries, including countries inside the European Union. Sophia, should Brussels be worried about this?
I think they certainly should. I mean, Russia's always had a close eye on Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkan states, and certainly has seized the day on the pandemic to try and make inroads there. And I think, unfortunately, the European Union did not have a brilliant pandemic. Their instincts at the beginning were not towards solidarity. Everybody pulled apart. The institutions had to sort of rather retrospectively try to impose solidarity and some ownership over the health services provision, because of course that function is held within member states. And then of course that sort of lasted in the first phase of the pandemic. Then of course with the vaccine, They haven't covered themselves in glory in terms of being able to really deliver for European citizens.
Yes.
So I think every time there's a gap there in leadership and power, and that solidarity principle starts to look like it might be a hindrance, Russia is always waiting at the gates to step in. And I think it is a dangerous moment. Nations like Hungary, for example, have decided just to go their own way and are starting to supplement their EU vaccines with Russia's vaccine. It's no coincidence. I mean, look at the name, Sputnik. It's extraordinary, and the symbolism there. Russia knows that we are constantly now re-evoking the language of the Cold War, and it's playing directly into the heart of that.
Yeah, and I get both of your thoughts on this, because there are dimensions and there are nuances to this, aren't there, Michael? It was, well, partly the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, vaccine rivalry, the vaccine race, which helped to eradicate smallpox.
Yes, exactly. But I think although there was a rivalry, it was very much done through a lot more solidarity than we're seeing now. So Russia, or the Soviet Union rather, provided a lot of the scientific know-how and produced a lot of the vaccine, whereas the US government provided a lot of the funding and the structures around which to roll out a global vaccination campaign. So it was a cooperative rivalry, which is not, we're not seeing that now. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out, just, Sophia's right, that the reason this is happening, though, is because global North governments have left a gap. Their failure to support the rollout of a global vaccine campaign has allowed for this to take place. And I think just as Russia and China may be getting the credit for giving vaccines, countries have also noticed the reticence of European governments, including the UK and North America, to fail to engage at all. And so, at the same time as they may be gaining credit, other governments may be losing credit for their inaction.
Yeah, I mean, you'd agree with that, Sophia. This is a harder form of soft power, if you like. Those providing the vaccines are looking to exact a bigger price in return.
Well, I think it's really sad if you look at the sort of geopolitical dimensions of the pandemic as a whole. The West entered the pandemic in pretty rough shape after a pretty bruising 4 or 5 years for that sort of liberal alliance. And rather than seizing this as an opportunity to demonstrate, the effectiveness of that kind of cooperation, everybody turned inwards. And I think that's going to have a quite significant legacy for this on the other side. I should just say, though, Britain is really leading the way in terms of the amount of aid and funding and resources that we're putting behind the big COVAX program. And I think that's partly because Britain recognizes, firstly, our status as a leading global aid donor is a really integral part of our soft power and international reputation. But secondly, the enormous cost globally in terms of economic growth. If we have a situation which is absolutely potentially on the cards, where essentially the whole of the global north is vaccinated and the global south is not, if there are ramifications for that, for the global economy as a whole.
Yes.
And these are the sorts of things that come back and make the world a more unstable and potentially dangerous place on the other side. So I think the British government does get that and is trying to lead to some extent on this.
So, Michael, there's an economic case, there's obviously a humanitarian case, but there's also a strategic case in not leaving the field too clear for powers like Russia and China. The countries like Britain and the West should get involved in doing what they're promising to do under COVAX and more for their own strategic interests too.
Yeah, I mean, look, my own view as to why we should be engaging with this is not really to do with strategic self-interest and soft power, but, we live in the real world, so it clearly is important. I have to say, though, if you look at what the government is doing to aid in general, it seems to be determined to completely wreck that ability to generate soft power. I mean, the feeling in regions like sub-Saharan Africa, which is the area I know best, is in despair at the government's actions. And you look at the announced sort of global policy today, and then you think about the actions over the past 12 months on international aid, and you have to ask, who is setting this policy? Who actually understands soft power and how UK has been able to maintain soft power over the previous decades?
Yeah. So if we move away, Michael and Sophia, from looking at it through the lens of the strategic balance of power and the role of countries like China and Russia, and look at it, if you like, through our own perspective, What are your feelings on the way that we are meeting obligations and living up to promises, Sophia, to help those poorer nations deal with their own coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I think it's interesting. The government clearly recognises the value of investments in public health in terms of it being a central part of our aid and development spending. And actually, I do a lot of public opinion polling on this. And actually, investments in global health is one of the most popular aspects of our aid spending amongst the British people. So I think they feel that they've got a sort of strong case through and through there. That said, I mean, look, there's no doubt that the decision to reduce the 0.7 GNI aid spending commitment has been costly on a number of levels. It is important to stress that the integrated review that's been published today does commit to restoring that. And I think actually that probably surprised a few watchers on.
Doesn't say quite when, but yeah.
Exactly. I think the biggest problem is that there's ambiguity over the tests that will be required to reinstate that. An enormous amount of political capital has been expended on that reduction, both in the UK and abroad. So I think the government's going to have to get on the front foot of this and set a much clearer time frame of when it's going to come back. It just says at the moment when the economy recovers. Well, I think if anyone was watching the budget closely, the forecast, the GDP forecasts are looking rather gloomy for some years to come. So I think the government needs to get control of the narrative on this again.
That's a pretty vague timetable. Sophia Gaston, thank you, Director of the British Foreign Policy Group, and also thank you to Dr. Michael Jennings from SOAS. Now, let's have a quick chat with Karen.